I'm going to say something about what Open Europe and a number of backbench MPs are doing to address the European predicament, and how people who aren't usually engaged in Westminster politics can help. The EU cannot go on like this, firefighting crises, losing ground against the whole of the rest of the world. Since 1995, its share of world GDP has dropped from nearly 30% to less than 20%, an astonishing verdict on economic mismanagement. Its response to the crisis has not just been effective, it has bred lasting resentment. Millions of southern Europeans have been driven to unemployment as the price for aid to protect the currency union. And relatively richer North Europeans are having to pay for bailouts which they had been explicitly promised were banned by treaty. This social tragedy, and it is a tragedy, will go on for decades. The classic remedy of default and devaluation is ruled out for political reasons, and anyway, it could be as bad as the disease given the massive intertwining of government debts and claims within the Eurozone. So the first thing to do is to face reality. Europe is 7% of the world's population and 50% of its welfare. Some say more than 50%. Unless we are 7 times smarter than people like the Chinese, this is plainly completely unsustainable. So we have no choice but to streamline the single market, cut waste, or sink still further down. If the economics are bad, Europe is almost equally unsatisfactory as an aspiring political union. A creed that finds concrete expression in laws whose chief purpose often seems little more than just to take powers away from national legislatures. Subsidies are one of the worst cases. They take up 1/3 of the whole EU budget without any pretense of an economic rationale. Every country in Europe would benefit if these subsidies were returned to member states, cutting out the farce of paying a lot into Brussels and getting some of it back. Britons, together with the Nordic countries, perhaps feel these encroachments on sovereignty more than most because of their very long democratic traditions. But the mood is changing everywhere. As William Hague said, the Dutch government has recently proposed, I don't think he quoted these exact words, but I'm going to quote them, that the EU should only do what it absolutely has to do, leaving everything else to the member states. The euro was a horrific case of putting centralization before economic sense. It would have been fine as a monetary policy for Germany, Austria, and the Netherlands, but letting the rest join was just sheer irresponsible nation building. It's a mark of how the centre of gravity has shifted since those days, especially here, but all across Northern Europe in particular, that the BBC, which for 4 years refused to allow Business for Sterling into its studios, now gives UKIP equal time with the relics of the pro-European movement, the pro-Euro movement, to debate whether to leave the EU or stay in. That sort of simplified confrontation leaves 2/3 of the British population out of the dialogue. The 2/3 who want the market they voted for, not the political union they didn't vote for, but will not be satisfied without change. Even among UKIP voters, 1/3 would prefer reform to getting out of the EU. They don't mean tweaks here and there. They mean a specific, large-scale reform program. Without that, the referendum result will in all probability be too close to settle anything, still less the long-term future of Britain's relationship with Europe, leaving half the country, whether the in or the out win, bitter and disenfranchised. Our EU friends, many of whom are here tonight, agree with us about reform, but some of them see Britain as what they would call lacking commitment to Europe, and they're right. No government that proposed making Britain part of a European political would survive political union would survive a month. But in other ways, they're not right. We are fully committed to Europe, to our cultural heritage, and to free markets trading peacefully with each other and around the world. As long as Europe defines itself as a would-be state, the famous ever closer union, Britain's ambiguity will remain incurable. Now, to answer Simon's and Tim's and Gisela's question about what is the alternative, it's a simple one. If Europe were to redefine itself as the single market, open to any democratic country, with its members free to make whatever political arrangements they like among themselves, as long as they respect the integrity of the market, few countries would be more committed than Britain. And you can be sure that Norway and Switzerland will be quick to join too. That would require impressive statesmanship in London, and especially in Berlin, where the fate of any renegotiation will ultimately be decided. It would be a colossal gamble for Berlin to offer half-hearted change. If the result was that Britain left, the EU would lose 15% of its budget funding, its financial centre, half of its military power, and its strongest voice against protectionism. Germany would lose its ability to outvote the Latin countries if they acted as a bloc to scupper a free trade agreement with the United States or to erect import barriers against emerging countries. So logic suggests that Berlin should support radical reform, knowing that they would be with the grain of their own voters, as well as voters across Europe and the instincts of much of North Europe. We aren't here making a case for British exceptionalism. Parliaments in every country should be able to block new unwanted EU legislation, and they should be able to roll back powers that should never have been ceded to the EU in the first place. If you believe that leaving the EU through the process of giving 2-year notice, which is what the exercise of Article 50 to get out would involve, is just as unattractive a proposition as soldiering on in this secular decline, then change is not desirable, it's absolutely essential. It's not enough to lobby ministers privately. Voters won't give a jot what any politician thinks if they think they're being taken for fools. Referendum after referendum has proved that. You have to make your voice heard, and I'm addressing myself here to those people who don't engage with politics, but ought to. You have to make your voice heard, as I say. A simple way to do this, just to make some propaganda for Open Europe, is that if you like our thinking, just put your name to Open Europe as a supporter. I'm not asking for money. I will ask you for money, but I'm not for the moment asking for money. That's a simple way to say you understand the problem. Take a look, for those of you who want to learn more quickly about this, at the Fresh Start group, a large group of MPs who've worked out with us a comprehensive reform programme. These MPs are able to argue their positions in great detail and carry the message to fellow parliamentarians on the continent, which is where the negotiations will succeed or fail. Many of these ideas will find their way into the government's programme. Some of them already have. This government has done as much for constructive change as any previous government, with some of the things that the Foreign Secretary mentioned: the reform of the fisheries policy, the budget cap, the safeguards against caucusing, which is actually an invention of Matt's here, and the work with other countries towards stopping benefit abuse. But the world has moved on. That's simply not enough. Health and safety, energy policy, benefits, employment law, pensions, insurance. These are all aspects of daily life that would be far better dealt with nationally than in Brussels. And we need to open up the market in services. This alone would add over 2% to the EU's and our own national wealth. With our sister offices in Brussels and Berlin, Open Europe is about to roll out a change program to young entrepreneurs across Europe, encouraging them to make their voice heard too. That has to be done because political activism of that sort is less common in Europe. But none of us can afford to sit back and let the old failed ways plough on. It's easy to be sceptical, and Nigel Lawson may one day be proved right that reform is a pipe dream. But it would be shamefully defeatist to give up without first making the greatest possible effort to achieve the reforms we all want. I have no doubt that that effort is starting on its long course from William's speech, but I hope he realizes, I'm sure he does, that it's only the first step on a very long course, and we have to get to the end. Thank you very much.